From today on, my money has nothing to do with you anymore. He didn't say it to my face. The words came through my phone, short and precise. At the exact moment I stepped off the courthouse stairs in San Antonio, Texas. The divorce papers were still warm in my hands, a thin folder holding 20 years of marriage, reduced to signatures and stamps. I stood there long enough for the sentence to sink in. Not just what it meant financially, but what it revealed. This wasn't anger. This wasn't confusion. This was a decision he had already made. Calmly, confidently, as if cutting me off were just another administrative task. Ahead of me, Raphael didn't slow down. He walked straight to the curb where a black car was waiting, opened the door, and slid inside. In the passenger seat sat a young woman in a pale pink coat, perfectly put together, relaxed, already settled into the role I had just been erased from. He didn't look back. He didn't hesitate. The car pulled away as smoothly as if this were the beginning of something celebratory, not the quiet disposal of a wife who had carried his life for 2 decades. I didn't cry. That was the first thing that surprised me. There was no collapse, no dramatic moment, just a heavy stillness in my chest. The kind that comes when something finally confirms what you've been avoiding. Around me, people moved in and out of the courthouse, strangers with their own stories, their own endings. I stood among them, feeling oddly invisible, like a woman whose usefulness had expired the second the paperwork was signed. The wind cut across the plaza, and I pulled my jacket tighter, noticing how even now I was dressed for practicality, not comfort. Old habits die quietly. For 20 years, I had learned to take up less space, to adjust, to wait, to believe that if I endured enough, everything would hold together. And yet, here I was, divorced not just from a man, but from access, from security, from a life I had helped build. I unlocked my phone without thinking. The screen lit up, familiar and obedient. For years, this device had been my responsibility. Checking balances, managing expenses, keeping everything running smoothly so no one else had to worry. I opened the banking app. The numbers appeared, orderly and calm. The same ones I had watched obsessively while telling myself money was just a tool, that family mattered more, that as long as I carried the weight, it was fine. Then I saw the list of authorized cards, the supplementary cards, opened under my name. Not just for him, but for his family. Cards I had issued out of trust, out of loyalty, out of the belief that generosity was the same thing as love. I stared at the screen and felt something shift. Subtle, but irreversible. A question surfaced, quiet and sharp. When did I start needing permission to be respected in my own marriage? When did partnership turn into access, and access turn into entitlement? In that moment, standing alone on the courthouse steps, I understood something with unsettling clarity. The sentence he sent me wasn't just cruelty, it was confidence. He believed the story ended there. He believed money was his final leverage, his clean exit, his way of reminding me who still held power. He was wrong. I didn't know yet how, or when, or what it would cost him. I only knew this. The woman he thought he had cut off was still standing, phone in hand, fully aware of where every line of control began and where it could end. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe to my channel and let me know where you heard my revenge story in the comments. I want to know how far it has gone. Before anyone asks why I didn't see it coming, I need to say this plainly. Nothing about it announced itself. There were no slammed doors, no raised voices, no dramatic ultimatums. It unfolded the way many dangerous things do, slowly, politely, disguised as reason. It began with compromises that felt normal, even loving, the kind women like me are taught to make without question. I left my career the first time Raphael received transfer orders out of state. I told myself it would only be for a season. One posting became another, then another, moving across military bases in 3 different states within 8 years. Each time, I packed our life into boxes, re-registered the kids at new schools, learned new streets and routines, while my resume quietly went stale. Before I left my job, I was earning close to $50,000 a year. I was proud of that. It gave me stability. Walking away felt responsible then, like choosing family over ego. My savings didn't vanish overnight either. At first, it was careful, almost invisible. 2,000 to cover a shortfall when his pay was delayed. 3,000 to help his mother when she fell behind on rent. Over time, the withdrawals became routine, justified by urgency. I watched an account I had built to nearly $38,000 shrink to a few hundred without ever marking a single moment as alarming. Each time I hesitated, Raphael reassured me, just until the next promotion, just until things stabilize, just until we catch our breath. And I believed him, because belief felt easier than facing what it meant if he wasn't telling the truth. I didn't tell anyone how much I was contributing. I wore the same coats year after year, skipped appointments, trimmed expenses down to the bone, because I thought that was what responsibility looked like. Eventually, money stopped being something we discussed and became something I managed quietly. The credit cards were technically my idea, or at least that's how I framed it to myself. My credit score was stronger, built carefully over decades, so it made sense for the primary account to be in my name. I added supplementary cards because it felt practical. One for Raphael, one for his mother, 2 for his sister, because she said she needed them for groceries and emergencies. A few more followed, 12, then 13, eventually 15 cards tied to my account. I told myself I could cancel them anytime. What I didn't understand then was how quickly generosity hardens into entitlement when no one is required to earn it. I became the one who tracked due dates, set reminders, made sure balances were paid. I knew exactly how much went to food, utilities, gas, school supplies. Raphael, meanwhile, had unrestricted access. He could log into the accounts at any hour, move funds, adjust settings I didn't fully understand. When I asked questions, he smiled and told me not to worry, that he handled the technical side better than I did. And I let him because I trusted him and because arguing felt exhausting. At the time, that trust felt like love. In hindsight, it feels like a blind spot I was encouraged to keep. The changes came quietly. A declined transaction here and there, a brief embarrassment at checkout, easily explained away. When I mentioned it, Raphael blamed the bank. "Systems glitch," he said. Then I noticed the available credit shrinking, month by month. Limits lowered once, then again. I didn't remember approving any of it, but he dismissed my concern, explaining that lenders adjust risk profiles all the time. I told myself I was imagining patterns where none existed. Stress makes people suspicious, I thought. I wanted to believe him. The first moment that truly unsettled me came one morning after I dropped the kids at school. I stopped for gas and my card was declined outright. No pending notice, no warning, declined. I tried again, then checked the app. I felt a tight, unfamiliar panic spread through my chest. I called Raphael. He didn't answer. When he finally responded hours later, he said he had attempted a payment from an old account that had already been closed, and that must have triggered a temporary freeze. His tone was irritated, as if the inconvenience was mine for asking. He said it would resolve in a few days. I wanted to believe him, even though the explanation didn't quite add up. He was meticulous with finances, too meticulous to make a mistake like that. That afternoon, I went to buy groceries. The card declined again. I stood there, heat rising to my face, put items back slowly, and left with nothing. I opened the banking app in the parking lot and felt my hands go cold. I could no longer view the account. No balance, no transaction history. Just a prompt to contact customer service. When I called after a long wait, the representative spoke calmly and professionally. She told me my name had been removed from the account, that as an authorized user, I no longer had access or decision-making power. When I explained that I had been the primary cardholder, that there had to be a mistake, she repeated herself without emotion. "Ma'am, you no longer have any authority on this account." I hung up and sat in the car, staring at the steering wheel, my heart pounding so loudly it felt physical. For the first time in 20 years, fear settled in. Not about losing a relationship, but about not being able to provide. I replayed the last few months in my mind, searching for something I had missed, a moment I should have questioned more closely. And still, denial clung to me. I told myself it had to be a banking error, that no one I had built a life with would deliberately cut off access to money used for food, for basic needs, especially knowing I wasn't working yet because of the move and my health. That night, lying awake, I interrogated myself more than I interrogated him. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe patience would fix it. Women like me are skilled at turning cruelty inward until it sounds like self-doubt. I replayed his calm explanations, his assurance that it was temporary. I told myself to wait because waiting had always been my role. What I didn't know yet was that this wasn't a mistake or a glitch. It was intentional. It was control, exercised quietly and precisely. And once I saw it for what it was, there was no unseeing it. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through timing, through coincidence that was too precise to ignore. And it hit me on a morning that should have been ordinary, The kind of morning where you expect your body to cooperate and your life to at least function on a basic level. I had an appointment that day, one I had postponed twice already, and when the doctor handed me the prescription, I stood at the pharmacy counter with that familiar mix of fatigue and hope, telling myself that at least this part was simple, that whatever chaos was happening elsewhere, I could still take care of my health. The card reader beeped, declined. I tried again, slower this time, as if speed had been the problem. Declined. The pharmacist looked at me with polite concern, lowered her voice, and asked if I had another form of payment. I didn't. I walked back to my car, with the prescription still in my hand, untouched, my chest tight, my mind scrambling for explanations that would make this feel less humiliating, less final. Sitting there, I opened my phone again, and that was when the message came through from my friend Lucia. A message that didn't ask how I was, didn't ease into anything, just dropped the weight straight into my lap. She said she had seen Raphael the night before at one of the most expensive hotels downtown, laughing loudly, dressed sharply, his arm around a young woman, bragging openly to the event coordinator about an engagement party that would cost $75,000, insisting it had to be perfect, grand, unforgettable. I stared at those words, reading them over and over, my hands beginning to shake, not because I didn't believe her, but because suddenly everything aligned with a clarity that made my stomach drop. The card wasn't frozen randomly. The timing wasn't bad luck. While I couldn't pay for a medication, he was putting down deposits, promising champagne dreams, performing generosity with money that had been siphoned quietly, deliberately, away from me. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I sat there in the car, feeling something inside me harden, like wet cement finally setting. I called him. This time, he answered. I didn't soften my voice. I didn't ask gently. I asked him directly why my card was locked, why I had been removed from the account, why I couldn't buy food, gas, medicine, while he was planning a $75,000 celebration with the woman he had replaced me with. There was a pause on the line, not the kind filled with confusion or concern, but the kind that comes when someone is deciding how honest they can afford to be. Then he sighed, as if I were exhausting him, and said it flat, cold, almost bored, that I needed to stop making everything his problem, that we were divorced now, and that I had to take responsibility for my own life. He said, "You have to figure out your own situation now," as if the last 20 years had evaporated overnight, as if the sacrifices I made had an expiration date he alone had decided on. I waited for him to say more, waited for some trace of guilt, some acknowledgement of what he was doing. But there was nothing, just distance, just finality, just a man calmly explaining that cutting me off wasn't cruel. It was practical. That was the moment something inside me finally broke open, not in a dramatic way, not with shouting or tears, but with a quiet, irreversible understanding. This wasn't a banking error. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't even neglect. It was punishment. It was control. It was a calculated move designed to leave me destabilized while he stood tall in public, surrounded by luxury, admired and envied. He hadn't just removed access to money, he had removed safety, dignity, autonomy, knowing exactly what that would do to me, knowing I wasn't working yet, knowing my health was fragile, knowing the children depended on stability I could no longer provide on my own. And still, I heard myself, even in that moment, trying to soften the truth, thinking maybe he didn't realize how bad it was. Maybe he assumed I had backups. Maybe he thought someone else would step in. That instinct to excuse him was still there, reflexive, trained into me over years of minimizing my own needs to preserve peace. But it didn't hold. It couldn't. Not anymore. I ended the call and sat in silence, my phone resting in my lap, my reflection staring back at me through the windshield, older than I felt, sharper around the eyes, stripped of illusions I didn't even realize I was still carrying. I thought about how carefully this had been done. The slow lowering of limits, the quiet changes to payment accounts, the rehearsed explanation blaming the bank. All of it layered in a way that allowed him to deny intent while achieving the same result. I thought about how many times I had been told not to worry, how often I had been reassured that things would work out if I just stayed calm, stayed patient, stayed reasonable. And suddenly, I saw it for what it was, a system built to keep me compliant, dependent, uncertain, always questioning myself instead of the person actively harming me. That realization didn't bring relief. It brought a heavy, grounding certainty, the kind that changes the shape of your thoughts permanently. I understood then that this wasn't about money anymore. It was about power, about reminding me of my place, about teaching me that if I didn't accept being discarded quietly, there would be consequences. I drove home without the medication, without groceries, without answers, but with something I hadn't had before. A clear line drawn in my mind. I had reached the bottom, not because I failed, not because I was weak, but because someone I trusted chose to push me there. And once I could name it for what it was, once I stopped calling it confusion and started calling it abuse, I knew there was no going back to pretending. The patience that had sustained me for 20 years didn't dissolve into rage that day. It condensed into resolve. I didn't yet know what I was going to do or how far this would go, but I knew, with a calm that surprised even me, that I would never again allow someone to starve me into silence. I didn't make the decision in a rush. That's what surprises people when they hear this part of the story. They expect rage, trembling hands, some dramatic moment fueled by anger. But when I finally sat down on the edge of my bed that evening, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator, what I felt wasn't fury. It was stillness. The kind that comes when you've already crossed the point of disbelief and there's nothing left to argue with inside yourself. I took out my phone and opened the banking app the same way I had done thousands of times before. Only now, for the first time, I wasn't opening it to manage, to fix, or to stretch what little remained. I was opening it to stop. The screen loaded slowly, almost respectfully, as if giving me time to reconsider. I navigated to the card management section And there they were, lined up neatly, each one marked active, card after card, each with its last four digits, each representing a person who had benefited from my silence. One for Raphael, one for his mother, two for his sister. Others I barely remembered approving, cards that had been justified as temporary solutions, as favors, as family obligations. I stared at the list longer than I expected to, not because I doubted what I was about to do, but because I was finally allowing myself to see the full scope of what I had been carrying. Every active card felt like a quiet demand that I remain available, useful, compliant. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. Who was taking care of me? My finger hovered over the first card. I thought about how many times I had reassured myself that I could cancel them anytime, that the power was technically mine, even if I never exercised it. That illusion fell apart the moment Raphael locked me out, the moment I couldn't buy food or medicine. Power you refuse to use isn't power at all. It's just permission waiting to be revoked. I tapped cancel. A confirmation prompt appeared, polite and neutral, asking if I was sure. I pressed yes. The screen refreshed. The status changed. One card down. I didn't pause. I didn't second guess. I moved to the next one and did the same. And the next. Each cancellation was quiet, unceremonious, accompanied only by a brief vibration from my phone and a line of text confirming the change. There was no rush of satisfaction, no triumphant surge, just a steady feeling, like tightening a knot that should have been tied a long time ago. While I was doing this, Raphael was standing in a hotel lobby across town, signing papers with a pen that probably cost more than the groceries I couldn't buy that morning. He was smiling, confident, promising a $75,000 engagement party, gesturing broadly as if money were an extension of his personality. I didn't see it happen, but I know the sequence now. The moment the first card was canceled, the payment terminal at the hotel rejected the transaction. The staff tried again, assuming it was a glitch. Another decline. Another polite apology. Raphael laughed it off at first, saying it must be the bank, that he'd sorted out. But when it kept happening, when every card he tried failed in front of people whose respect he was desperate to maintain, the atmosphere shifted, confidence thinned, smiles tightened. The illusion began to crack, quietly, just as mine had. Back in my bedroom, I kept going. I canceled every single supplementary card. I didn't leave one active out of habit or sentiment. Not for his mother, not for his sister, not for anyone who had watched me give and give without ever asking if I was okay. With each tap, something inside me loosened. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't punishment. It was a boundary, finally drawn with clarity instead of apology. I realized then that stopping didn't make me cruel. It made me honest. I had been told for so long that my worth was tied to what I provided that it felt almost unnatural to withdraw support. But as I looked at the now empty list, all cards marked inactive, I felt a quiet relief settle into my chest. The phone buzzed with notifications confirming the cancellations, one after another. I didn't flinch when I saw them. I didn't rush to mute the sound. I let them come. Somewhere, a conversation was unfolding without me, voices lowering, faces stiffening, as Raphael realized that the money he had assumed would always be there was suddenly inaccessible. Somewhere, a hotel employee was saying, calmly and professionally, that none of the cards were going through. I imagined the pause that followed, the subtle embarrassment, the forced smile. And still, what I felt wasn't joy. It was closure. Not the kind that comes with apologies or explanations, but the kind that comes when you stop bleeding yourself dry for people who never notice the cost. I set the phone down beside me and sat there for a long moment, listening to the quiet. No one was yelling, no doors were slamming, nothing dramatic was happening in my living room. And yet, everything had changed. For the first time in years, I wasn't trying to fix a situation I didn't create. I wasn't negotiating my own survival. I wasn't waiting for permission to protect myself. I had simply stopped. Stopped paying. Stopped covering. Stopped making it possible for others to live comfortably while I was left scrambling. I knew the fallout would come. I wasn't naive about that. Phones would ring, accusations would follow. I would be called selfish, bitter, dramatic. But as I sat there, I understood something with surprising calm. Ending support wasn't an act of aggression. It was an act of self-preservation. I wasn't taking anything that wasn't mine. I was reclaiming what had always been under my name, my responsibility, my risk. And in that quiet room, with no audience and no applause, I felt something settle into place inside me. For the first time since the divorce papers were signed, I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. I didn't whisper a promise to myself. I didn't make a speech. I just took a breath and let the reality of it sink in. Finally, I had stopped. And stopping, I realized, was the most powerful thing I had done in 20 years. It didn't take long for the silence to break. Less than an hour after I canceled the last card, the knocking started. Not a polite knock, not the kind that waits for permission, but loud, sharp pounding that rattled the front door and sent a jolt through my chest. I didn't have to look through the peephole to know who it was. My sister-in-law had always entered spaces the same way she entered conversations, aggressively, convinced she was owed attention. When I opened the door, she didn't greet me. She pushed past me into the living room, as if she still belonged there, her face flushed, her voice already raised, words tumbling out before I could say a single thing. She accused me of humiliating her brother, of ruining something important, of embarrassing the whole family. She cried loudly, dramatically, but her tears didn't soften her tone. They were weapons meant to make me retreat, to make me feel guilty enough to undo what I had done. She waved her phone in my face, showing me missed calls and messages, telling me Raphael was in a hotel lobby looking like a fool because of me, telling me that people were watching, judging, laughing. I listened without interrupting, noticing how quickly her concern for him turned into anger toward me. Not once did she ask why I couldn't buy groceries or medication. Not once did she mention the months of quiet manipulation that led to this moment. To her, the only injustice was that the money had stopped flowing. When I calmly told her the cards were in my name and I had canceled them, she stared at me like I had broken an unspoken rule. She called me ungrateful. She called me cold. She said a decent woman would never do something like this. And then, as if on cue, she stormed out, promising that their mother would hear about it, that I would regret choosing this path. She was right about one thing. Her mother did hear about it. The call came later that afternoon, her voice thick with indignation, dripping with disappointment that felt rehearsed rather than sincere. She didn't ask if I was safe. She didn't ask how I was managing. She told me I was being unreasonable, that I was behaving like a woman who didn't know her place. She said I should have been more understanding, more flexible, more grateful for what her son had given me over the years. When I tried to explain, calmly, that I had been cut off financially, that I couldn't even access my own account, she interrupted me sharply and said, "A woman who knows what's proper wouldn't make things so ugly." In that moment, I understood something painful but clarifying. In her eyes, my role had never been partner or family. It had been function. And functions aren't supposed to resist when they're no longer convenient. That evening, my phone rang again. This time, it was Raphael. I didn't hesitate. Before answering, I turned on the recorder. It felt strange at first, like crossing a line I had avoided for years, but something in me knew I needed to stop relying on memory and start relying on facts. His voice came through sharp and furious, stripped of the calm control he usually maintained. He accused me of sabotage, of acting out of spite, of trying to destroy his future. He said I was greedy, that I was obsessed with money, that I was doing this because I couldn't stand to see him happy. I listened as he rewrote our entire history in a matter of minutes, transforming himself into the victim and me into the villain. Then his tone shifted, dropping into something colder, more deliberate. He told me to think carefully about what I was doing. He reminded me that custody arrangements weren't finalized yet. He said people like him had resources, lawyers, influence. He said I could make this easy, or I could make my life very difficult. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I let him talk. When he threatened to fight for full custody, my hands tightened around the phone, but I said nothing. When he suggested that I wouldn't survive financially without him, that no one would help me once he told his side of the story, I felt a familiar pull toward self-doubt. For a moment, the old instinct surfaced, the urge to placate, to soften, to negotiate peace at my own expense. But that instinct didn't take hold. Instead, I noticed the steady blink of the recording icon on my screen, silently capturing every word, every threat, every attempt to intimidate me back into compliance. When he finally paused, expecting a reaction, I said only that we would communicate through proper channels from now on, and I ended the call. The messages started soon after. Texts accusing me of theft. Emails implying I was unstable. Hints dropped to mutual acquaintances that I was mentally unwell, that I was trying to extort him, that I had always been difficult with money. He painted me as a woman who had lost control, who couldn't accept the end of the marriage gracefully. Reading those messages hurt more than I expected. Not because I believed them, but because I recognized the strategy. This wasn't just anger, it was a campaign. He was trying to isolate me, to poison the narrative before I could speak for myself. And that was when something inside me shifted for good. Instead of responding emotionally, I began to document everything. I saved the voicemails. I took screenshots of every message. I labeled files with dates and times. I backed them up to a cloud account he didn't know about. Each action felt grounding, purposeful. I wasn't spiraling anymore. I was organizing. The chaos he was trying to create started to feel less overwhelming once I saw it laid out clearly, line by line, threat by threat. This wasn't a misunderstanding between two hurt people. It was a pattern, a deliberate attempt to regain control by fear, shame, and reputation damage. Late that night, sitting alone in the quiet, I replayed the recordings once more. Hearing his words without the pressure of responding allowed me to hear them differently. They weren't the words of a man caught off guard. They were the words of someone angry that his leverage had been taken away. And for the first time, instead of shrinking under that anger, I felt something else rise to meet it: clarity. I realized that I didn't need to convince him of anything. I didn't need his approval or his understanding. What I needed was protection, evidence, and time. As I set my phone down and turned off the lights, I understood that this phase, the ugly one, the loud one, was inevitable. People who benefit from your silence rarely accept boundaries quietly. They escalate, they smear, they threaten. But I also understood something equally important. I was no longer alone inside my own head. I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't minimizing. I was paying attention. And once a woman stops doubting her own reality and starts recording it instead, the balance of power begins to shift, whether the other side realizes it yet or not. I didn't wake up one morning suddenly brave. What happened instead was quieter and far more important. I stopped trying to survive everything by myself. For years, I had been trained to believe that asking for help meant weakness, that handling things privately was dignity, that involving others would only make matters worse. But after the threats, the smear messages, the endless attempts to scare me back into silence, something inside me finally gave up on that belief. I realized that isolation was not strength. It was exactly where he wanted me. And the moment I stepped out of that isolation, everything began to change. The first person I told everything to was my closest friend, Elena. Not the softened version of the story, not the one where I minimized the damage or made excuses for his behavior, but the full truth. From the locked cards to the threats about custody. She listened without interrupting, without trying to play devil's advocate, without telling me to calm down or be patient. When I finished, she said something so simple it caught me off guard. She said, "This isn't messy. This is abuse." She didn't hesitate. She didn't dress it up in polite language. She named it clearly, and in doing so, she handed me something I hadn't had before. Certainty. She told me I wasn't crazy, I wasn't dramatic, and I wasn't overreacting. She told me that what he was doing had a name, and that names mattered, especially when it came time to defend myself. It was Elena who insisted I speak to a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but someone who specialized in financial abuse during divorce. I hesitated at first, worried about costs, worried about escalation, worried that involving the law would somehow make me the villain he was already painting me to be. Elena didn't let me retreat into those fears. She reminded me that I had already been escalated against, that silence hadn't protected me, and that information was not aggression. It was preparation. She even sat with me while I made the call, her presence steady, grounding, as if lending me courage I hadn't fully claimed yet. The lawyer's office was small and unassuming. Nothing like the intimidating spaces I had imagined. When I sat across from her and laid out the facts, she didn't look surprised. She nodded slowly, asked precise questions, and took notes without judgment. When I explained the transfers, the lowered limits, the account manipulation, she stopped me gently and said, "You need to understand something very clearly. Money transferred to a romantic partner during a marriage is considered marital property in most jurisdictions. That money doesn't disappear just because he spent it." Hearing that felt like oxygen reaching a part of me that had been suffocating. She went on to explain that deliberately cutting off access to funds used for food, healthcare, and basic living expenses could legally qualify as financial abuse, especially when used to intimidate or control. I felt something shift in my posture as she spoke. For the first time, my experience was being translated into language that carried weight beyond my own voice. A few days later, I returned to the bank in person, not to beg for access, but to ask questions. I didn't go alone. Elena came with me. We sat across from a customer service representative who spoke carefully, professionally, clearly aware that this situation was sensitive. I explained what had happened, calmly, without emotion, sticking to facts. At first, she gave the standard responses, policies, limitations, procedures. But as the conversation went on, her tone changed. She lowered her voice slightly and looked at me directly. "You should know," she said quietly, "that what you're describing is not uncommon, and you are not at fault here." That sentence stayed with me long after I left the bank. It wasn't an official statement. It wasn't something she could put in writing, but it mattered because it confirmed what I was beginning to understand. This wasn't just my private nightmare. It was a pattern. And patterns could be challenged. With each conversation, each piece of information, my fear began to reorganize itself into something more useful. Strategy. I learned what documentation mattered. I learned how to frame events clearly, without apology. I learned that I didn't need to justify why I needed access to money for basic survival. That need was assumed. That right was fundamental. The lawyer helped me outline next steps. Not aggressively, not recklessly, but deliberately. Preservation of evidence, temporary financial orders, clear communication boundaries. Every step was about stability, not revenge. What changed most, though, wasn't external. It was internal. For the first time in my adult life, I stopped asking for permission to protect myself. I didn't ask Raphael to explain himself anymore. I didn't ask his family to understand. I didn't ask the bank to bend rules out of kindness. I acted. I gathered. I documented. I consulted. Each action felt small on its own, but together they created momentum. I was no longer reacting to his moves. I was preparing my own. One evening, as I organized files and notes at the kitchen table, I realized something quietly profound. I wasn't afraid of him the way I had been before. The fear hadn't vanished, but it no longer controlled my decisions. It had been replaced by clarity, by support, by the knowledge that I was not standing alone against a narrative designed to erase me. I had allies now, people who saw the situation clearly, professionals who knew the terrain, and friends who refused to let me minimize my own experience. That was the moment I understood the real shift had already happened, not in court, not on paper, but inside me. I had stepped out of isolation and into action. And once a woman stops asking for permission and starts moving with intention, the ground beneath her changes, whether anyone else is ready for it or not. The ballroom looked exactly the way money is supposed to look when it's trying to impress people. Warm lighting, crystal glasses catching the glow, white linens pressed so sharply they felt untouchable. A string quartet tucked into one corner, playing something soft and elegant that made the whole scene feel rehearsed, controlled, important. Guests filled the room, men in tailored suits, women in carefully chosen dresses, laughter floating easily from table to table. This was the world Raphael wanted to belong to, the world he had been selling himself to for years. The image of success, generosity, confidence, and standing just outside that room, watching through the partially open doors, I understood why he had gone to such lengths to keep me invisible. I didn't fit the picture he was trying to frame. I didn't arrive early. I didn't arrive late. I arrived exactly when I needed to. The engagement party was well underway. Drinks already poured, compliments already exchanged, the kind of event where people relax into assumptions. Assumptions about wealth, about character, about who deserves to be celebrated. I stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of the documents in my bag, the familiar calm settling into my chest. I wasn't there to shout. I wasn't there to beg. I was there to tell the truth in a room that had been built on a lie. Raphael stood near the center of the room, glass in hand, laughing loudly, one arm wrapped around Isabella's waist. She looked radiant, confident, glowing with the certainty of someone who believes the ground beneath her is solid. I recognized that certainty. I had lived in it once, before I learned how quickly it could be pulled away. Around them, people nodded and smiled, congratulating, praising, reinforcing the version of him he wanted the world to see. No one noticed me at first. That was fine. I didn't need attention. I needed timing. When the music softened and Raphael lifted his glass to make a short speech, I stepped forward. Not into the spotlight, not dramatically, just far enough that my voice carried. I said his name, calmly, clearly. Conversations stalled, heads turned. The room quieted in that subtle way it does when something unexpected interrupts comfort. Raphael froze for half a second, the smile still on his face, before recognition set in. His eyes widened, not in anger yet, but in calculation. He hadn't expected me to be there. He had been very careful to make sure of that. I didn't accuse him first. I didn't speak about betrayal or humiliation. I reached into my bag and pulled out the event contract, held it up just enough for those closest to see. I said, evenly, that before anyone celebrated, there were a few things they deserved to know. I explained that the contract for the party had not been fully paid, that the deposit was incomplete, that the balance had been postponed more than once. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, polite confusion turning into curiosity. Raphael interrupted me, his voice sharp, telling me to stop embarrassing myself, telling everyone I was bitter, unstable, trying to ruin his happiness. I let him talk. Then I placed the bank statements beside the contract, the numbers clear, undeniable. I explained where the money had come from. Not his success, not his savings, mine. Marital funds. Funds he had transferred quietly, deliberately, to support this new life while cutting me off completely. Isabella's smile faltered. She looked at him, then at the papers, then back at me. I didn't look at her. I spoke to the room. I explained how the cards were locked, how I couldn't buy groceries or medication, how on the same day he was promising a $75,000 celebration, I was being told I had no right to my own account. Someone near the back gasped softly. Someone else shook their head. The atmosphere shifted just a degree at first, like a temperature change you don't notice until it's too late. Raphael tried to laugh it off, to joke that this was a private matter, that I was exaggerating. That was when I pressed play. The recording wasn't loud, but the room was quiet enough to hear every word. His voice, cold, dismissive, telling me to figure out my own life, reminding me I was on my own now, threatening consequences if I didn't cooperate. There was no emotion in it, no ambiguity, just control, just entitlement, just proof. The sound filled the space between us, stripping away the charm he had been wearing all evening. When it ended, the silence was heavier than any shouting could have been. People began to move, slowly at first. Chairs scraped back. Glasses were set down unfinished. A man who had been laughing with Raphael moments earlier avoided his eyes and walked toward the exit. A woman whispered something to her husband and followed. Conversations broke into fragments, disbelief and discomfort spreading through the room. The image Raphael had curated began to collapse, not explosively, but piece by piece, as people withdrew their approval. Isabella stepped away from him, her hand slipping from his arm. She asked him quietly if what I said was true. He answered too quickly, too defensively, and that was enough. She shook her head, tears welling, the illusion she had bought into dissolving in real time. Raphael turned back to me then, panic finally overtaking anger. He accused me of theft, of manipulation, of ruining his life, but his words no longer carried weight. The room had already decided this wasn't a jealous ex-wife making a scene. This was a reckoning. Guests continued to leave, some offering awkward apologies as they passed me, others refusing to meet my gaze at all. The staff exchanged looks, unsure how to proceed. The music had stopped, the celebration was over, even if no one formally announced it. I stood there, documents still in hand, feeling none of the triumph people imagine in moments like this. What I felt was release, not because he was humiliated, but because the truth was finally louder than the story he had been telling. Isabella walked out without looking back. Raphael stood alone in the center of the room, the glass slipping from his hand, shattering on the floor unnoticed. His reputation, the thing he had guarded so fiercely, lay in pieces around him. I didn't wait for security. I didn't wait for the last guest to leave. I turned and walked out calmly, my steps steady, my breathing even. Outside, the night air felt cooler, cleaner. Behind me, the doors closed on a party that would be remembered not for its elegance, but for its collapse. I hadn't gone there to destroy him. I had gone there to stop him from destroying me in silence. And as I walked away, I understood something with absolute clarity. Power doesn't vanish when it's exposed. It transfers. And in that moment, standing under the open sky, I knew exactly where it belonged. What followed wasn't dramatic in the way people imagine justice to be. There were no viral videos, no public apologies, no grand speeches about accountability. What came instead were consequences, quiet and unavoidable, the kind that settle in slowly and stay. Within weeks, Raphael paid what he owed, not because he suddenly understood morality, but because contracts, banks, and courts do not negotiate with charm. The engagement venue billed him for the damages, the unpaid balance, the disruption. His accounts were audited. Questions were asked by people who had once trusted him without hesitation. Trust, I learned, disappears faster than money when the truth comes out. His work suffered first. Clients distanced themselves, then canceled outright. The same people who had clinked glasses with him at that party stopped returning his calls. He lost projects, then his position, then the reputation he had spent years constructing on my labor and my silence. Without the steady image of success, the rest of his life unraveled naturally. His family, once so united in defending him, fractured under pressure. His mother blamed his sister. His sister blamed him. The loyalty they had demanded from me proved fragile when there was nothing left to extract. I watched none of this closely. I didn't need to. Their collapse was no longer my responsibility to witness. My life, in contrast, grew quieter in the best way. I started working again, not out of desperation, but out of choice. A modest position at first, nothing impressive on paper, but it was mine. My name on the contract, my account receiving the deposit. The first paycheck felt heavier than it should have. Not because of the amount, but because of what it represented. I could buy groceries without checking balances 3 times. I could refill prescriptions without panic. I could put gas in the car without rehearsing explanations in my head. Financial autonomy, I learned, is not about luxury. It is about breathing without fear. I set boundaries the same way I set up my budget, deliberately and without apology. I stopped answering calls that existed only to intimidate. I stopped explaining myself to people who had already chosen not to understand. Silence, once used against me, became a tool I wielded with intention. My days developed a rhythm: work, rest, small routines that grounded me in the present. I paid bills on time. I planned ahead. I slept through the night without waking to imagined crises. Peace arrived not as a sudden gift, but as a series of ordinary moments stitched together. Emotionally, the shift was gradual. There were mornings when old doubts resurfaced, when a familiar voice in my head questioned whether I had been too harsh, too final. But those thoughts grew weaker each time I answered them with facts. I remembered the locked cards, the empty pharmacy counter, the way he had told me to take care of my own life while using my resources to build another. Clarity replaced guilt. I wasn't cruel. I was finished being available for harm. I didn't rebuild my life to prove anything to him or to anyone else. I rebuilt it because it was necessary. Friends re-entered my world naturally, the kind who asked how I was and waited for the answer. I learned to accept help without shame and to give it without overextending myself. Independence taught me discernment. Not everyone who smiles deserves access. Not every relationship is meant to be preserved at any cost. Stability, I discovered, is created through consistency, not sacrifice. Looking back, I don't frame what happened as a victory over another person. I didn't win because he lost. I didn't rise because he fell. Those are stories people tell to make pain entertaining. My truth is simpler and far more important. I stopped participating in my own erosion. I stopped negotiating with disrespect. I stopped believing that endurance was the same as love. Justice didn't arrive with noise or celebration. It arrived when the system recognized facts, when money followed records, when accountability followed actions. Today, my life is not extravagant. It is honest. My finances reflect my choices, not someone else's control. My time belongs to me. My future is planned with intention instead of fear. I make decisions without asking permission. And when I look at myself in the mirror, there is no longer a woman calculating how much she can endure. There is simply a woman standing in her own space. I didn't defeat anyone. I didn't seek revenge. I did something far quieter and far more powerful. I removed my consent from being harmed. And once I did that, everything else fell into place exactly as it was supposed to. If you're still here with me, I want to speak to you directly now. Not as a character in a story, not as someone watching from a distance, but as one woman to another. Because stories like this don't stay on the screen. They echo into real kitchens, real bank apps, real nights when you lie awake calculating how much control someone else has over your life. Let me ask you something honestly. Have you ever been controlled through money? Not in an obvious way, not with loud commands, but quietly, slowly, in small decisions, in permissions you didn't even realize you were asking. Have you ever felt that tightening in your chest when you checked a balance? Or that hesitation before buying something basic? Because you weren't sure how it would be received later. And another question, one that's harder. If today were the day, if you were pushed to the edge the way I was, would you dare to close the wallet? Would you dare to say, this stops here, even if it meant being called selfish, dramatic, ungrateful, or cruel? Because that's the price many women are asked to pay the moment they choose themselves. I'm not asking these questions to judge you. There is no right or wrong answer. Fear is real. Dependence is real. And sometimes survival looks like endurance. until another door opens. What I want you to know is this. If you recognized yourself anywhere in my story, you are not weak, and you are not alone. Financial control is not love. It is not protection, and it is never accidental. If you feel comfortable, I invite you to share in the comments. You don't have to tell your whole story. You can answer with just one sentence. You can simply say where you're watching from or whether this story felt familiar. Sometimes, knowing that someone else is listening from another city, another country, another quiet room is enough to break the isolation. And if you want to stay with me, if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories about women who reach a limit and choose clarity over chaos, I invite you to follow this channel. These stories aren't about drama for drama's sake. They're about recognition, about naming things that are often hidden, about showing that quiet decisions can change entire lives. I also welcome respectful discussion here. Different experiences, different choices, different paths. Not every woman can leave. Not every woman should, immediately. But every woman deserves awareness, options, and dignity. If this story stirred something in you, speak gently, both to yourself and to others. We're not here to attack. We're here to understand. So tell me, if you feel ready, where are you listening from today? And after hearing the story, what stayed with you the most? Thank you for spending this time with me. Your presence matters more than you know. And if you choose to come back, I'll be here with another story, another conversation, another reminder that silence is not the same as peace.